Presidents make good drama, but sometimes directors turn that good drama into movies that are more fantasy than biopic. These are a few of the so-called biopics and historical epics that have sent experts spiraling.
I'd like to give Richard Nixon the trial he never had.
It was during journalist David Frost's multi-day interview of disgraced former President Richard Nixon that Nixon bluntly declared,
"I'm saying that when the president does it, that means it's not illegal."
But while Sir David Frost was a very real journalist and Nixon was, well, Nixon, 2008's Frost-Nixon, directed by Ron Howard, isn't quite on the level. While the movie iteration of Tricky Dick, played by Frank Langella, basically spits out his bombshell admission, the real-life Nixon dropped his bombshell in an almost mundane fashion.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
The actual Frost recalled Nixon not as a sly schemer, but a bit of an awkward weirdo, recalling, "He was the most fascinating man. There's never been anyone who was such an enigma in the Oval Office." Dramatic license is understandable, maybe, but then there's the matter of the money. Frost-Nixon isn't shy about the fact that Frost scored the interview by being the highest bidder, but it does skip the part where Nixon not only got a $600,000 fee, but a 20% cut to future syndication. Frost didn't really back Nixon into a corner either. Nixon's quasi-admission of guilt was allegedly all part of the plan crafted not just by Frost, but by Nixon's own team.
All right, Mr. Lincoln. There are other ways to collect the debt.
Okay, who really expects a movie named Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter to hew closely to the historical record? In fact, the weird thing is how much it actually gets right, including the depiction of the Capitol and House chamber back in 1865 and a pretty darn accurate portrait of an ambitious, articulate Lincoln. This only makes the film's historical inaccuracies more galling. Yes, obviously vampires didn't help the Confederacy, but skipping that part, the movie puts Lincoln at the Battle of Gettysburg. That didn't happen. And the part where Abe almost magically demands all the silver in the Union? Nope, completely made up. But the most appalling part of the movie is its treatment of slavery. Lincoln is portrayed as a heroic anti-slavery activist who treats a black associate, William H. Johnson, as an equal.
This is Will Johnson. Will Johnson, my oldest friend in the world.
In real life, Johnson was a servant and free man who Lincoln arranged to have buried in Arlington National Cemetery, but they weren't best buds. Lincoln actually had complicated views about the rights of black Americans that, to his credit, evolved over time.
I have the train, I have the silver, soon I'll have the whole country.
And one more thing, using vampires as stand-ins for real Southerners is a bit of a cop-out. But at the end of the day, this is a movie about Lincoln wielding an axe against the undead. Perhaps historians should take a chill pill and let this one fade into obscurity. Lest you think historically awkward presidential biopics are a thing of the past, you need only turn to 2024's Reagan. And when we say biopic, maybe. That is if you watch with one eye closed and maybe occasionally shut the other one for good measure.
Dutch, there's a purpose for your life.
As played by Dennis Quaid, Reagan comes across as a modern-day saint who might as well have put on a cape, flown himself across the globe, and challenged all anti-America baddies to fisticuffs, which they would obviously lose.
There's nothing a retired governor can do about the Soviets, but a president, now he can do a thing or two.
The thing is, while Number 40 did come to political prominence in part for his anti-communist stance, there was plenty more to the guy that didn't make it anywhere near the film. There's no mention of his pushback against the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, for instance. And the movie doesn't touch on the budget cuts that disproportionately affected poor Americans and people of color, or that old chestnut, the war on drugs. And don't forget his attempts to do away with Medicare or his unfulfilled promise to dismantle the Department of Education. And then there's the big one. The movie barely hints at the Reagan administration's egregious mishandling of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Nearly 90,000 people died of the disease during Reagan's term, but the president's only acknowledgement of it was a December 11, 1984 press briefing in which acting press secretary Larry Speakes laughed about it. When it comes to movies dripping with historical inaccuracies, few hold a candle to 2001's Pearl Harbor. First, there's the film's depiction of President Franklin D. Roosevelt as played by Jon Voight. In a scene in which FDR is briefed on the attack and its aftermath, an advisor warns that a Japanese invasion may be coming. But no one at the time believed that. Japan's military capabilities simply weren't up to it. Then, in the same scene, FDR dramatically hauls himself to his feet, struggling against a paralysis resulting from his 1921 bout with polio as the soundtrack swells. But Roosevelt routinely demonstrated serious upper body strength by moving himself around under his own power. In fact, plenty of Americans actually believed he could walk. Nor is there any indication that he ever tried to wow anyone by simply standing or otherwise using his partial paralysis as dramatic punctuation.
Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of light in the bushes, and then shots rang out.
Few things upset presidential historians more than a JFK assassination conspiracy. And part of the reason these ideas are still around more than 50 years later has to do with the Oliver Stone movie JFK. Where to start with this one? The 1991 film, which actually focuses on the aftermath of the assassination, first presents JFK as such a radical that he was targeted for assassination by his own government.
I never realized Kennedy was so dangerous to the establishment.
But JFK was hardly a leftist or communist sympathizer. Some modern commentators have even wondered if he might align more with today's moderates or even conservatives, though that's highly theoretical. The film's government conspiracy to assassinate JFK is almost entirely made up. The bits that are sort of based in truth, like character William O'Keefe's confession, are wildly removed from reality. The truth is that O'Keefe's real-life counterpart, Perry Russo, only delivered a more interesting testimony after he was given sodium pentothal, a barbiturate referred to at the time as truth serum. Meanwhile, legit ballistics experts don't buy the magic bullet theory presented in the film's courtroom.
Anyone who's been in combat will tell you never in the history of gunfire has there been a bullet this ridiculous.
Though the Warren Commission's investigation of the assassination is marred by allegations of government whoopsies and cover-ups, it hardly opens the door to whatever's presented in JFK. Even Stone himself has admitted that he doesn't know what happened during the assassination and has said that his film is based on vibes.
It's a mystery wrapped in a riddle inside an enigma!
Steven Spielberg and his team deserve credit for making Amistad, a 1997 film about a real 1839 uprising on a slave ship, but that doesn't mean it's something to hang your history hat on. Let's start with the fact that in the film, former President John Quincy Adams defends the Africans who revolted and seized the Amistad. True.
These slaves, Your Honor, are by rights the property of Spain.
The real Adams convinced the U.S. Supreme Court the rebels were free men and secured their safe return to Sierra Leone. But the film depicts this ruling as a major turning point in the U.S.'s attitude towards slavery. It wasn't. The Civil War was still 20 years in the future. And some of the same justices who presided over the Amistad trial ruled in the 1857 Dred Scott case that enslaved people were not American citizens.
Immediately surrender these goods!
But to get back to Adams, Amistad makes it look like he wasn't very interested in taking on the defense in the first place. False. In real life, Adams was an abolitionist, and he was so committed that he argued his case for 8 straight hours before the Supremes. And although he won the ruling by making the point that the enslaved Africans were essentially kidnapped and were therefore free men and not property as the other side insisted, the idea that minds and hearts were forever changed by the Amistad case is pure fiction.
He's the best master in all of Virginia, but he is the master.
Back in 1995, when Jefferson in Paris was released, the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and the enslaved Sally Hemings was rarely discussed, so points to the filmmakers in that regard. We now know that Hemings, who traveled to Paris with Jefferson from 1787 to 1789, had at least 6 of Jefferson's children.
They don't speak of it now, and they didn't speak of it then.
The story didn't enter the broader public consciousness until the late 1990s, when genetic testing confirmed Jefferson fathered Hemings' youngest known child, Easton. Unfortunately, the movie itself isn't all that accurate, and not just because Jefferson is played by Nick Nolte, who mostly just looks like Nick Nolte in a wig and not a founding father. For one, Hemings would have been about 14 at the time, though she was played by then 23-year-old Tandy Newton. While the real Jefferson, then widowed, did develop a close relationship with married artist Maria Cosway during this time, it doesn't appear to have progressed much beyond walks and yearning letters in which he makes it clear he's not down for anything more. Meanwhile, the film has the French smugly pointing out racial inequality in American society. Even though the French colony of Saint-Domingue was home to hundreds of thousands of enslaved people and saw a 1791 slave revolt that led to the founding of Haiti.
Guess what happened to us today?
Okay, 1999's Dick is obviously a comedy and perhaps not a movie that we should take all that seriously. After all, it depicts the infamous Deep Throat who passed on vital bring down the president level information to Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein as a pair of teenage girls played by Kirsten Dunst and Michelle Williams.
Why were they shredding all that paper?
Paper mache is a hobby of mine.
Just so we're clear, the real Deep Throat was FBI Assistant Director W. Mark Felt, whose identity was only revealed by his family in 2005. And then there's the improbability of Williams' character briefly falling in love with Richard Nixon. Not to mention the notion that 2 teenage girls could somehow wander around the White House and accidentally make their way into the Oval Office. Security back in the 1970s wasn't like it is today, but it was still the White House. When it comes to TV movies about presidents, you could do far worse than The Crossing. In this 2000 A&E film, Jeff Daniels plays George Washington during the crossing of the Delaware and the Battle of Trenton. While the movie is generally considered historically accurate, there are at least a couple of major oversights that could get a historian all out of joint. The biggest may be the claim that the Continental Army saw 0 casualties during the crossing or battle.
How many men have we lost? None. Wounded? None.
In fact, there were at least 6. One of that number was none other than future President James Monroe, who suffered a major shoulder wound during the Battle of Trenton. Then there's a scene where Washington pulls a gun on General Horatio Gates, who was admittedly a pain and one of the worst generals at the time. But as annoying as Gates may have been, there's no record of Washington nearly shooting him before deciding to fire him instead. If you want to get nitpicky, as good as Daniels is, the real Washington's voice most likely had more of an English lilt to it. He was also reported to have mumbled, thanks to recurrent upper respiratory infections and those infamously bad teeth of his.
Mr. President, what place do you think you have in history?
In history? In history, we'll all be dead.
Further staking his claim in the world of dubious presidential film accuracy, here's Oliver Stone again. This time he's making mincemeat of more recent history with W. The 2008 film that came out while its namesake, 43rd President George W. Bush, was still in office. With so much recent, well-documented history going on, how could W be so inaccurate? Stone hired advisors who worked in the Bush administration, including retired Rear Admiral Deborah Lower, who not only managed the White House Situation Room, but was even traveling with Bush on September 11, 2001. She told Politico that the visual details of the Situation Room were highly accurate, and that Josh Brolin, who played Bush, took care to get his portrayal just right.
Iran is not Iraq, and Iraq is not Iran. I know that.
But others accuse Stone of manipulating history, including making Bush seem like an affable goof caught in a tough spot and Vice President Dick Cheney a silent, looming villain. And there are more obvious missteps, like not including September 11th in the film at all. And then there's Bush's infamous "fool me twice" flub.
Fool me once, shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
This makes it into the movie, but instead of happening in front of a crowd, he stumbles over the line in a private meeting.